Welcome to the Civil War, the short version. It's very difficult to condense something that people have written, books this fat on, into one, half-hour-ish long lecture, but I'm going to try. I do hope that you go and find things that you're interested in and check out the longer lectures. But for those of you, this is not something that you're particularly interested in. Here is the Civil War, the short version. So we're going to pick up the story in April of 1861. After Fort Sumter has been fired on, President Lincoln has decided to coerce the 11 southern states that seceded back into the Union by force. And basically what you're looking at in the Civil War is a conflict on four fronts, a conflict in four theaters. The most important theater was a theater in and around northern Virginia, here in between the two capitals, the capital of the United States in Washington, D.C., right there, and the capital of the Confederate States of America, Richmond, Virginia, sort of around here. Only 80 miles separated the two cities. So the first theater is what's known as the Eastern Theater, and it took place in and around this part of the country here. The second theater is known as the Western Theater, and it starts down along here, along the Mississippi and Tennessee rivers, here in western Tennessee, and it works its way sort of across the south this way, and then eventually up. Those are the two main military theaters, your Eastern Theater here, and your Western Theater, sort of mostly in and around here, and then working its way across the state of Tennessee that way. The third theater of war was at sea, as the Union attempted to blockade the southern coast. We're going to talk about that. And the fourth theater of war was the diplomatic theater of war, where no guns fired and nobody was killed or wounded or died. But the two nations, the Confederate States of America and the United States of America, either struggled to get foreign countries to do what they kind of wanted them to do. So this short version of the Civil War is going to start at the diplomatic theater and then work its way back to Virginia. So number one, the diplomatic war. One thing that defines a country, any country in the world, is that other countries in the world recognize it and say, hey, we're a country and you're a country. And when countries try to split off of other countries, they need all the other countries in the world to look at them and say, yes, you're a country. You could, if you want, go into your bedroom and say, hi, this is my country. But if none of the other countries recognize you as a country, it's going to be kind of pointless. Your parents probably wouldn't even recognize your country. So one of the main goals of these 11 seceded states, one of their main goals, the Confederate States of America, was to gain recognition of itself as an independent country. And the two most important countries in the world, besides the United States at the time, were Britain and France. And the Confederate States said, hey, if we could get France and Britain to recognize us as a country and come in on our side in the war, that would certainly help us. If you go back to the Revolutionary War, it was when France recognized the United States as an independent country that the war kind of turned in America's favor. So the Confederate States want to get France and Britain on their side and break the Union blockade. The South believed that European and specifically British dependence on cotton made it so that Europeans would have to recognize them. Now this is so super duper important. The South's main money-making, their only money-making export is cotton. Cotton feeds the factories in the North, and it feeds the factories in France, and it feeds the factories in England that make textiles. So the South kind of looked across the ocean and they said, we have something they need. And they need it so badly that they'll go to war with the United States to make sure that they get it from us. They thought that cotton was going to win the war for them. And that the Britain's need for cotton would make it so that they would come into the war, recognize the Confederacy, and come in on their side. So that's what the South wanted. The North's diplomats, of course, worked to prevent that and said to Great Britain and France, do you really want to go to war with the United States? We have such a positive trading relationship. You know, going to war with the United States is nothing to laugh at. This is not the United States of 1812. This is the United States that took care of Mexico nice and easy, you know, had a huge army, a huge navy. Messing with the United States of America could be a very dangerous thing for France and Britain. And that's what Northern diplomats were kind of saying, you know, in their subtle, couched diplomatic language in Paris and in London. Relations between the United States and Great Britain were strained at the time. They were not so super-duper friendly. In many ways, the British were much more like the South than they were the North, kind of with a landed aristocracy and significant class differences that most of the people in the British government identified more with the South than the North. So there was some tension there between the United States and the British Empire at the time. So letter B is something called the Trent, T-R-E-N-T. Mr. Edward Trent was the man's name. We saw him in the Mexican War. The Trent Affair. In November of 1861, a British ship, the HMS, excuse me, Trent's the name of the ship, not the name of the guy. It's Slidell from the Mexican War. Trent's the ship, Slidell's the guy. James Slidell, from Mexican War Slidell mission, is working for the South. He's a Southerner. And he boards a British ship, the HMS Trent, to go to London. A Union warship stopped this British ship, ordered her to, you know, heave to, and arrested these two Confederate officials. This is a violation of international law. People are allowed to travel on neutral vessels in times of... So this was what the United States Navy did. It might make sense, but it is also technically illegal. And it made the British very angry. And they threatened war with the United States. And President Lincoln apologized. He released the Southerners to go to England. But there was bad blood between the United States and Great Britain that President Lincoln always sort of had on his mind. But just like the Battle of Saratoga in 1777 kind of opened the door for French intervention in the Revolutionary War, the South needed a big victory to come in on the side, to have Britain and France come in on their side during the war. And both invasions of the North by the South are kind of predicated on this need. A great victory on Union soil to bring the French and the British in to the war on their side. So throughout letter C, throughout 1862, the Confederacy was enjoying significant success on the battlefield. And their continued success on the battlefield made London and made Paris more and more likely to recognize the Confederate States. So in the summer of 1862, General Robert E. Lee of the South said, we only need one more great victory to bring Britain and France along onto our side, and we're going to have to invade the North and win that victory on Northern soil. So Lee invades the North, and we're going to talk about this a little later, but number two, he loses, or he doesn't win. It's kind of a draw, but Lee's forced to retreat. So number two, the Confederate loss at the Battle of Antietam, A-N-T-I-E-T-A-M, the Battle of Antietam prevents this knockout blow from occurring. And if you want to look into more about the Battle of Antietam, it's the bloodiest day in American history. It's in the notes on 1862. If the South had won at Antietam, it would have been very likely that Britain and France would have come into the war on the side of the Confederacy. So Lincoln's got this anti-British feeling on his mind. He knows that the South is close to being recognized. And one thing, kind of genius, that Lincoln does to kind of turn Britain and France against the South was to recast the war. And Lincoln recasts the war in the Emancipation Proclamation and then again in the Gettysburg Address. So letter D. One of the reasons that Lincoln promulgated the Emancipation Proclamation was to turn the Civil War into a war to end slavery. Why? Well, Britain and France in the 1860s are both, well, Britain is a democratic country, France less so. But France is still kind of, public opinion is important in France, and public opinion drives the government in England. England in the 1860s is a free, sort of democratic government. It's ruled by Parliament, which is elected by a number of the people. Not all of them, but a number. The common British citizen was very anti-slavery in the 1860s. The British thought that slavery was uncivilized. The British thought that slavery was a throwback to an ancient barbaric era. That the churches in Britain played a huge role in ending the slave trade. The British Navy actually ended the slave trade, from Africa. So the average British citizen is very anti-slavery and is going to elect to Parliament people who reflect that point of view. So when Lincoln turned the war into a war against slavery, it made the British government hesitate and say, ugh, do we want to join the side of this slave-owning power? This part of the United States that seceded and left the country solely because of slavery. And a lot of British politicians kind of look and say, ugh, no, they don't want to be called on that. Once the war became a war about slavery, Britain kind of backed off and said, we can't side with a slave power so obviously when this is an anti-slavery country. And France was not going to do anything without Britain. France kind of, in this case, went along with what the British did. So once this became a war against slavery, the British were sort of out. And the South's, the letter E, King Cotton, question mark, the South's belief that cotton would kind of win the war for them was a little unfounded. Southern cotton was not as needed as the South hoped it would be. The British had a large supply on hand when the war started, and they changed suppliers. Once Southern cotton got cut off, the British said, all right, well, we'll grow it in Egypt, we'll grow it in India, we'll grow it in Australia, and we'll ship it to our factories from there. That Southern cotton, it was kind of sad for the South that their stuff was not nearly as vital as they imagined it was. So letter F, as the South started to fail militarily, and after the war became a war against slavery, and after cotton was not needed anymore, sort of around the summer of 1863, all hope for European intervention ended. And after that, President Lincoln did not have to worry about fighting the British and the British Navy and the French Army with the southern states. So those three things prevented foreign intervention. One, the South could not get their one big victory militarily. Two, Lincoln turned it into a war against slavery. And three, cotton was not as important as the South thought it was. So there's our first theater of war, the diplomatic theater. Number two, the war at sea, the Naval War. The most important aspect of the Naval War during the Civil War was, letter A, the blockade. One of the key Union strategies to win the war is a blockade of the South and Southern ports. What is a blockade? Well, B-L-O-C-K-A-D-E, the root of the word is obviously block. A blockade is when one country's navy blocks all trade from coming in or going out of another country. Basically what would happen is every single port on the southern coast would have a big giant Union Navy squadron outside of it. And this big giant Union, and it started small and got bigger and bigger and bigger as the war progressed. The U.S. Navy was not big at the beginning, but it got very large by the end. This Union Navy would stop ships coming in and ships coming out. It's very simple. And it prevented the South from exporting its cotton. It prevented the South from importing military goods that it needed. Throughout the war, as the Union captured more and more southern ports, and the Navy became larger and stronger, the blockade on the South grew tighter and tighter and tighter. By 1864, it's nearly impossible for the South to send anything out or take anything in. So this blockade, think of it as kind of a noose, a rope around the South, squeezing off its trade and its foreign commerce. Well, the South tried three basic ways to break the blockade. They said, oh my God, our cotton is so important, we need to get our cotton out. They tried three different things to break the Union blockade. They could not hope to build a navy. Building a navy is the work of a generation. You cannot just build a navy from scratch in 2 years. And most of the naval officers in the United States stayed loyal to the Union. Even Southern naval officers tended to stay loyal to the Union when war broke out. So the first thing, really what the South tried was technology in order to break the blockade. Letter A, ironclads. And you can look at the picture in your notes. In early 1862, the Confederates sailed the first ever ironclad, and it's clad or covered in iron. That's what it is. It is a ship covered with iron. The first ever ironclad warship was the CSS, the Confederate States ship, Virginia. Sometimes historically it's known as the Merrimack. You might see either one on an AP test. The Merrimack, actually what this ship was an old Union ship that was kind of damaged. The South took it, and the name of the Union ship was Merrimack. The South renamed it Virginia, but on a test you might see either name. The CSS Virginia sailed into battle in Hampton Roads, Virginia, right up in here, in an attempt to break the Union blockade. And this ironclad ship, all the Union ships made out of wood fired their cannons, and the cannons just bounced off the sides. And then the cannons fired by Merrimack, or Virginia, obviously destroyed the Union ships. And on the first day where this Merrimack, or this Virginia, was operating up here in Virginia, they had great success. And they left when it got dark, and they came back the next day, and the people in the South were like, woohoo, we're going to break this blockade. However, the next day, when she sailed up into Hampton Roads, Virginia, to attack again, she was met by a Union ironclad known as the USS Monitor. And this duel between the Monitor and the Merrimack is famous in the history of warfare. It's the first ever battle between two ironclad warships. And it ended in a tie because the cannonballs for each one just bounced off the other. So all day, the two ships kind of sat there circling around each other, blowing the hell out of each other to no real damage. And what it did for the world was watching, believe me, and they realized, oh crap, our navies are completely obsolete. That a fleet of ironclad warships could destroy any navy in the world at the time. So Monitor v. Merrimack is a revolution in naval warfare. It's an failed attempt for the South to break the blockade. The second type of technology the South tried to use were submarines. The CSS Huntley became the first submarine ever to sink an enemy ship. However, Huntley sank on its way back to base after sinking this ship, and then the South kind of gave up with submarines. The South tried commerce raiders, letter C, which were ships built in foreign ports, and believe me, that did not make the Union happy. They're small, fast ships that can swoop by the blockade, but they're so small and they're so fast, they can't carry much cargo. And some of them had some success. The CSS Alabama, the CSS Shenandoah, but their successes were small and limited and more for propaganda purposes than anything that actually broke the blockade. In fact, the South was completely unable, to break the Union blockade by 1863, and it just grew ever stronger and stronger. That's why the South wanted Britain in the war so badly. The British Navy, the most powerful navy in the world, could have broken the blockade, but Britain didn't come into the war on their behalf. So the Naval War is, there's two things you really got to keep in mind for the Naval War. First is Monitor and Merrimack, the two ironclads, and the second is this boa constrictor blockade of southern ports. Now let's get to the war. The actual fighting, the men involved. Number 3, the war in the West. We're going to start out here, the war in the West. Now, at the very beginning of the war, old General Scott, Winfield Scott, from the Mexican War, is in charge of Union strategy. And he has a plan to defeat the Confederacy that's known as the Anaconda Plan. Anaconda as in a big snake. Scott's plan is to blockade the coast and to take the Mississippi River and cut the South in half. that if Scott took, or if the United States took the Mississippi River, all of this fertile, good land with lots of supplies and horses and food and men would be cut off from the rest of the Confederacy. Then you can kind of deal with them separately and then deal with this separately. So part of the plan is to capture and conquer the Mississippi River. Letter B. The first huge battle in the West is the Battle of Shiloh. S-H-I-L-O-H, the Battle of Shiloh. And the Battle of Shiloh takes place in mid-1862, right down here in the very southwest corner of Tennessee. The Union wins the battle, allowing it to threaten the Mississippi River down here in the south. It is the Battle of Shiloh is a great story, and again, check out the 1862 notes. The Battle of Shiloh is the bloodiest day by far, the bloodiest day so far in American history up to that point. There are tens of thousands of casualties, about 3,000 killed and about 20,000 wounded at the Battle of Shiloh, and it shows both sides that the war is going to be very long. So this Union victory down here at Shiloh allows the United States to start taking the Mississippi River. It comes down from here, and also the port of New Orleans was conquered in 1862 by Admiral David Farragut. And letter C, the Battle of Vicksburg. Vicksburg is right here on the Mississippi River in the state of Mississippi. On the 4th of July, 1863, letter C, the Battle of Vicksburg. On the 4th of July, 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant captures the city of Vicksburg in Mississippi. That's the last Confederate town in Confederate hands on the river. Once Grant takes Vicksburg, all of the Mississippi River is now in Union, Northern, Federal hands. The Confederates could no longer move from one side of their country to the other because the river was in Union hands. The Confederacy had been cut in half. Okay. After his victory at Vicksburg, Grant moves his army. Grant actually, after his victory at Vicksburg, is called to command all of the Union armies, and he's called back to Washington, D.C. His successor, a guy by the name of William Tecumseh Sherman, takes the army from Vicksburg, marches it through Tennessee, winning battles all along the way, and in the middle of 1864, General Sherman conquers Atlanta. Okay, so that's letter D. After Sherman conquered Atlanta, he engages in something called, letter E, what's come known to history as Sherman's March to the Sea. His March to the Sea. And what he pretty much does, after conquering Atlanta, he takes the army, leaves their supplies behind, and drives all the way through the entire state of Georgia, just living off the land. All of the food they need, or they had some small supply lines. Most of the food they needed, the supplies they needed, they just took from this part of Georgia. Anything they could not use, they destroyed. And that's his specific plan. Sherman is going to march through Georgia, take what he needs, and destroy everything else. And this is new and brilliant in modern war. He is, B1, focusing not on the military aspect of war, but on the economic and psychological aspect of war. And what it's called, number 2, is total war. Total war is defined as making war on everything that could help the enemy. Not just their army, not just their politics, but their psyche, their economy, their social system. General Sherman is making war on everything that the South is in Georgia. And his troops, they burned farms and burned houses and burned crops and burned barns along the way. He put out big public notices for slaves to run away from their masters in Georgia to join them. And he sends out his army not on a narrow column, but 60 miles wide of destruction cut through central Georgia from General Sherman. A 60-mile swath of complete destruction across the entire state of Georgia. He finally reaches the sea down here at Savannah on Christmas of 1864, sends a telegraph message to President Lincoln saying pretty much, Merry Christmas, President Lincoln, here is the city of Savannah. This is one of the most important events in American military and world military history, really. It is one of history's first modern examples of total war, which is something that would come to define the 20th century. So that's the first thing. This is total war. War on the population, war on the economy, war on the social system, war on the psychological state of the people. It is not just soldier fighting soldier. It is an attempt by one army to break the other side. The Confederacy has been sliced in half again. That it's been sliced in half here, and now it's been sliced in half here. At this point, the only major army still fighting for the Confederacy is here in Virginia. But after the Confederacy has been sliced in half again, no material from the old Deep South can reach General Lee and his army up in Virginia. And even more important than that, letter D, few things in the war lead to as much physical and psychological consequences as Sherman's march to the sea. It told the South, it advertised to the South, Union troops can go wherever they want. And the South could not stop them. That once Sherman won his battle at Atlanta, there was virtually no Confederate troops left to contest his march. And it's an advertisement. You have lost. The Northern Army can go wherever it wants and do whatever it wants to do. And that destroys the South's will to resist. They kind of give up after Sherman's march to the sea down here in the Deep South. The rest of the war in the West, after Sherman's march to the sea, Sherman then turns north through the Carolinas, driving a small Confederate army before him. By this time, General Sherman's got 125,000 men. The most the Confederates can put into the field is about 10,000 against him. So Sherman just walks his way through South Carolina into North Carolina, and F1, 2 weeks after General Lee surrendered to General Grant in Virginia, General Joseph E. Johnston surrenders to Sherman. And that's where the war in the West ends. Starts here, conquers the Mississippi, cuts the South in half once, and then cuts the South in half again, focusing on Sherman's march to the sea. Let's go to the war in the East, number 4. The war in the East is what most people think of when they think of the Civil War. Richmond and Fredericksburg and Gettysburg and Antietam are all battles in the East. And the Eastern theater of the war takes place, like I said earlier, in between the two capitals, Washington and Richmond. And we're going to load up a different map here to get a better look at this war in the East. Civil War, Eastern Theater, map. That's not bad. That's, I don't want any, that's 18. I just want a map. I don't want any lines on it. How about just Virginia? Eek. No. 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 I don't want any lines, darn it. Oh, wait a minute, look at this. I don't know what this is. Hey, there's a good one. Copy. Paste. Oh, that's perfect. Okay. Let's orient ourselves. Here's the state of Maryland. Here's Washington, D.C. There's the Confederate capital of Richmond. Okay, so let's start in 1861. The first battle of the Civil War is known as the Battle of Bull Run. Bull, as in a male cow, run. It's the name of a stream. In 1861, a few months after Fort Sumter, let's go back in time here. Fort Sumter's just been fired on. The armies are forming. Both sides think that the war is going to be short, painless, and will be home by Christmas. That from Washington, D.C., a northern army starts marching with their goal of capturing Richmond, Virginia. But here at a little town called Manassas by a stream called Bull Run, an inexperienced Union army attacks an inexperienced Confederate army. And after some initial success here at Manassas, this Union army is pushed back and their retreat becomes a rout. The Battle of Bull Run is well known for three things. One, it's the first battle of the Civil War. Two, it's the first time in history railroads had been used to bring up reinforcements. The South rushes men to the battlefield on railroads. And third, a man by the name of Thomas Jonathan Jackson becomes very, very famous, and he gets a nickname, Stonewall. Stonewall Jackson will become General Lee's most trusted lieutenant for the first half of the Civil War. So this Bull Run, first Bull Run, sometimes called the Battle of Manassas, but first Bull Run is a significant Union loss. And the Union troops run back to Washington, D.C. After the battle, the generals that had been in charge, General Scott and a man by the name of General McDowell, were replaced. Number two, after the battle, General George McClellan took over the Union Army, and he plans on attacking with a much larger army the Confederate capital the next year. So let's go to 1862, the Peninsula Campaign. General McClellan thinks to march all the way overland to Richmond is silly and a waste of time, and he would be much better putting his troops on boats and sailing here and advancing on Richmond up the James Peninsula. So he lands his troops here and starts making his way towards Richmond. McClellan is a good general for one thing. McClellan is a good administrator. He trains the troops well. He equips the troops well. The troops love him for it. He takes care of the troops. He is a great general until the fighting starts. But McClellan is timid. McClellan is cautious. McClellan is scared to move sometimes. McClellan constantly thinks he is facing more Confederates than he really is. Also, on this march up the peninsula, he constantly thinks he is facing more troops than he really is, and he constantly delays. He delays and delays and delays until finally General Robert E. Lee for the South makes his name and kicks McClellan off the peninsula, and poor McClellan is forced to retreat back to Washington, D.C. And that's number two. Lee took command of the Confederate forces and drove McClellan back, and then McClellan had to go home. Lee says, okay, we've thrown this giant army out of the South. It is now time to have our knockout blow of the North. Let's destroy their army, knock them out of the war, make them think the war's not worth fighting, and get Britain and France to come in on our side. So General Lee decides, number two, to invade the North in what's going to become known as the Battle of Antietam. A-N-T-I-E-T-A-M. Lee takes his men and marches up through Virginia and invades the state of Maryland, aiming for Pennsylvania. Lee invades Maryland. McClellan follows him. The two armies meet outside the town of Sharpsburg. It's right over here, outside Hagerstown. Again, McClellan has more men, lots more men. He outnumbers Lee 2-1, but he never engages Lee's entire army at once. And McClellan has a chance to destroy Lee's army completely here at this battle, but he blows his chance. So 2A, despite overwhelming numerical superiority, McClellan never engages Lee's entire army at one time. McClellan stops Lee's advance. Yes, Lee has to retreat back into Virginia, but McClellan does not come chasing after Lee. And because President Lincoln could not understand why McClellan didn't move his army after General Lee, Lincoln fires McClellan. So that's the first Confederate invasion of the North. It ends at the Battle of Antietam. The battle is kind of a draw, but since the South retreated, it's put in as a Union victory. And that victory gave President Lincoln cover, letter B, to promulgate and to publish and to put out there the Emancipation Proclamation. We're going to talk about this in another set of notes later in the block. But the Emancipation Proclamation frees all slaves in areas under Confederate control. All right, and that's Lincoln's first move to turn this into a war against slavery. A few more months go by. A new Union commander, General Burnside, at the battle number 3 of Fredericksburg. General Burnside tries to dash to Richmond and destroy the Confederacy that way. But Burnside is also moving too slowly. He is forced to attack Lee up this sloping hill called Marye's Heights, and his army is cut down. 14 times the Union men charged up this hill, and 14 times the Confederates on the hill, behind a wall, sunken road. They had every possible advantage. 14 times General Burnside's assaults are thrown back with heavy, heavy losses. And then Lincoln sort of fires Burnside and puts a man by the name of General Joseph Hooker in charge of the army by 1863. Hooker attempts the same thing sort of as Burnside did, but in a slightly different location. Again, in 1863, General Hooker's men attempt to march from Washington and take Richmond. Outside the town of Fredericksburg this time, about 15 miles to the west, Hooker is confidently advancing. He outnumbers Lee more than 2-1. And Hooker's like, I'm the best general in the world. I'm going to, set myself up as dictator after I win. This idiot Lincoln doesn't know what the hell he's doing. I'm going to win the war, and then everything's going to be great. Ha, ha, ha. And then he probably had a prostitute come into his tent, and that's why we call them hookers. That's true, by the way. General Lee of the South. General Lee's genius, and he was not a military genius. Those are few and far between in history. But he was a very good general, General Lee. And what made Lee a good general is he psychologically understood his enemy. He understood the Union commanders better than they even understood themselves. And he knew Hooker. And General Lee knew that Hooker was a lot of bark and not a lot of bite. That all of Hooker's what seemed to be confidence was not really confidence, but bluster. And Lee said, he won't move. He won't attack. He'll get here and he'll freeze up. And lo and behold, that's exactly what General Hooker did. In front of Richmond, General Hooker froze. General Lee divided his army in half, sent one around the side, and attacked General Hooker's army from the side. Hooker's force, C1, is smashed, and another northern attempt to take Richmond is gone. After Lee's stunning success at Chancellorsville, and then Lincoln fires Hooker. After Lee's success at Chancellorsville, he gambles. He rolls the dice and says, okay, we need to end this war. In order to do it, we are going to invade the North again and try to get a great victory on northern soil, which will knock the North out of the war completely. So from Virginia, General Lee invades the North one more time, marches through Maryland, and the armies will meet in a small little town in southern Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. Number 2, the Battle of Gettysburg, is Lee's attempt for another knockout blow of the North. And we're obviously going to talk about this in greater detail in class. To make a long story short, Lee is unsuccessful at Gettysburg. The North wins that battle. It is the turning point of the Civil War. But the war does not end. 1864 rolls around. General Grant from the West is now in charge of the army in Virginia for the North, and now he goes up against Lee. And Grant attacks, almost in the same, just a little further west than Chancellorsville. And he loses. But General Grant is onto something. And number 2, Grant's terrible calculus. Grant looks around and he realizes what he has and what he does not have. He cannot match Lee move for move on the battlefield. And Lee constantly outgenerals him. But Grant never retreats. After that first loss, he just keeps going. And Lee is forced to fight him again. And Grant loses, but he keeps going. And Lee is forced to fight him again. And Grant kind of fights it to a tie, but he keeps going. And then Lee fights him again, and he loses. But in losing, he just keeps moving the army south. And this is his terrible calculus. Letter B. Grant knows that General Lee is inflicting heavier casualties on him than he is inflicting on General Lee. But the North's got more people. And what I want you to put in his blank, he knows that even though Lee is inflicting heavier losses on him than he is on Lee, he can replace his men. Lee can't. And it's as simple as that. It becomes a mathematical equation. There's a lot more fresh meat in the North than in the South. Grant's casualties are constantly replaced. Lee's casualties are never replaced. By the summer of 1864, Grant has come all the way south of Richmond, outside the town of Petersburg. He has forced General Lee into trench warfare to defend Petersburg and Richmond. Lee can no longer maneuver. He is stuck in trenches against Grant's much larger army. And Lee, if he cannot maneuver, cannot win a war of attrition. And a war of attrition is pretty much 10 of my guys die, 8 of your guys die, but guess what? There's 10 more where I came from, and there ain't no 8 more where you came from. That's a war of attrition. Lee cannot win a war of attrition. Grant can. Grant becomes known as Butcher Grant, which is not really a fair nickname. Grant was a good general. He was not as good a general as Lee, but he did not just waste his men. Grant's ability came in his toughness, and Grant knew that he just had to keep the army fighting, and eventually General Lee would be stretched so thin that he would break. And in 1865, that's exactly what happened. In the spring of 1865, after all this moving, and Lee moving with him, Grant finally gets behind Lee at the Battle of Five Forks in the spring of 1865. And once Grant is behind Lee, Richmond, the capital, has to be evacuated. The government and General Lee flee west. Grant follows. And on April the 9th, 1865, outnumbered about 8 to 1, General Lee finally surrendered his army to General Grant at a place called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. That's the name of the town. It's not an actual courthouse. The name of the town is Appomattox, A-P-P-O-M-A-T-T-O-X, Courthouse, Virginia. And with the touching And I suggest take a look at the 1865 notes. It's one of the most touching, powerful, pathetic, dramatic scenes in all of American history. Once General Lee's army surrenders, the war is pretty much over. Johnston surrenders in the Carolinas a few weeks later. A few weeks after that, the last Confederate troops in Texas surrender. And the war is over. And the Union has been saved. And that's the Civil War in 45 minutes. That was like one class. How do you like that?